So Alexander the Great apparently died from excessive drinking and a severe chest wound. And our story has reached the most interesting part. Now we will try to put together everything Plutarch said and find out what he was really trying to tell us between the lines. So let's begin.
Catastrophe.
Throughout Plutarch's entire account, we gradually realize that Alexander set out to conquer Persia for more than just a simple reason. First of all, he was completely confident in victory, so much so that he burned all his bridges behind him, giving away his possessions to relatives and friends. Such fanatical confidence cannot be based on mere daring, since Plutarch repeatedly shows the reader his wisdom, prudence, and talent for strategic planning from a young age. And yet Alexander did not have the slightest doubt, even though he was going up against an empire that had repeatedly conquered Greece and forced it to pay a hefty tribute. However, the calm crossing of the Hellespont, cities surrendering without a fight, small groups of resistance, and Darius's army being at the farthest end of the Persian Empire all tell us that the territory was practically empty. Plutarch even gives us the date of the catastrophe. It happened on Alexander's birthday, 20 years before his campaign. Remember his lines. On Alexander's birthday, the stone temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned down. And all the prophets said that day that an unprecedented misfortune had befallen Asia. How could the prophets have known that Philip had a son? But they could very well have witnessed the catastrophe with their own eyes. And with this kind of wordplay, Plutarch disguised an important event. He seemed to be talking about Alexander, but he openly stated the date of the catastrophe, at least the month and the day. And if this was a cosmic catastrophe associated with the fall of clay and sand, then according to my theory, it should have left a meteor trail, repeating every year at the same time. Alexander was born on the 6th day of the month of Hecatombion, which is roughly after the 20th of August, give or take a week. And it is during this time that one of the strongest meteor showers occurs, which, by the way, is called the Perseids. For more details about my hypothesis that meteor showers are traces of collisions between celestial bodies and the Earth, see the video Silent Witnesses, and we move on. All through his youth, Alexander was preparing no less to conquer the world. However, his father Philip was constantly at war with the neighbors. And although the wars were more than successful, it would have been logical to subdue all the nearby territories before leading the army thousands of kilometers away from home, or to create a reliable defensive line in case of a sudden and treacherous attack by the neighbors. Thus, it was necessary either to build a network of fortresses along the borders or to use natural barriers like mountains or the sea as the border. From the northwest, Epirus was conquered, and it served as a kind of barrier between the mountains and the sea. To the east, Greece was separated from Persia by straits and the Sea of Marmara, but to the northeast, there where modern Bulgaria, Romania, and so on are located, there lay the unconquered territories of the warlike Scythians, who were constantly rebelling as well. They were last subdued by Alexander himself. Therefore, in my opinion, the wisest course would be to head north along the Black Sea coast to Crimea and then continue on, subduing or devastating Scythian settlements along the way.
3.
One of the main arguments historians make for why Alexander chose this direction for his first attack is his love for Homer and his desire to capture ancient Troy and visit the tomb of his distant ancestor Achilles. In addition, he expressed a desire to be buried next to him, and this feeling is understandable. However, there are serious doubts about the very location of Troy that was discovered by Schliemann. It was originally a trading city, a center of international trade between Asia and the Mediterranean states, including Africa. It was supposed to block and thus control the waterway of trade. That means the city should be located right on the shore of the strait, or even better, on both sides of the strait, in order to be able to fire upon or block the passage of any ship if desired. From this point of view, Byzantium, present-day Istanbul, was well located, but not Ilion. Ilion is located 5 kilometers from the shore, which makes it completely useless and worthless from a military point of view. Of course, you could say that the sea level was higher back then, but the key feature is control. If there was more water, then the strait was even wider, 7 or 8 kilometers wide. To control such a body of water from the shore, even with modern weapons, it's difficult. At the very least, you need howitzers like Mistoris, self-propelled howitzer, or Gvozdika. Regular direct-fire guns simply won't reach. Besides, vessels are divided into sea and river types. The port, being a center of trade, was supposed to be a transshipment base where cargo could be transferred from sea vessels to river ones. This means that such a city should be located in the deepest part inland, where sea vessels can reach. And at the same time, it should be situated on a river, through which it would be possible to reach any part of the continent on lighter river vessels. The only such place that still serves these functions to this day is the place where the Don flows into the Sea of Azov. And the city of Azov on one side and Taganrog on the other perfectly fit the parameters described above. All the other candidate cities, Kerch, Istanbul, Sebastopol, and Lyon, are just places for a stopover and possible control. They lack the key element, a river. Thus, ancient Troy could only have been in the area of Asov and Taganrog. There simply are no other places, and the oldest fortress in Taganrog is even called Troitskaya. And for some unknown reasons, both Peter, the Turks, the Swedes, the French, and the English all wanted to capture it more than once. You can learn more about this in the first 5 films of the Mysterious City series. And if that's the case, then Alexander traveled by land along the coast, through Scythian territory, straight to Taganrog. But the original sources don't mention this at all. Or are there actually some mentions? Of course there are. First, Plutarch hints at Alexander's battle with the Scythians. Second, he mentions the crossing of the Don, the Tanais. Third, he talks about making peace with the Scythians. After that, the king of the Scythians gave him his daughter in marriage as a sign of friendship, and also reinforced his army with his own warriors. All of this is said, on the one hand, as if between the lines, but nevertheless in plain text, disguising the presentation of the material as meaningless conversations.
Cold.
In exactly the same way, Plutarch persistently tells us that where Makedonsky went, it was much colder than in Greece. Of course, some will say that it really is colder in the mountains, and most historians will simply start ignoring this fact altogether. However, first of all, there are mountains in Greece as well. However, there are no mentions that the Greeks dressed much warmer because of this. And secondly, let's look at the current average monthly temperatures in Greece and Persia. As you can see, there's either no difference at all or it's very small. The cold described by Plutarch could only be found much farther north of Greece, which could correspond to Siberia, Muscovy, or Kazakhstan in winter, but definitely not Persia. The conquest of Alexander Makedonsky is dated to the 300th years of our era, and after crossing the Hellespont and then winning at Issus, Alexander supposedly moved along the Mediterranean coast. By this time, the biblical events should have already taken place, and Makedonsky's army inevitably had to pass through Israel and Jerusalem. However, there are no mentions of Jews or Jewish settlements in Plutarch's writings. He only talks about 2 cities that lay on his path, Tyre and Damascus. Let me emphasize once again, I am not paying attention to the conclusions of British Oxford scholars. I am only talking about the primary sources. And if a city like Jerusalem had been on Alexander's path, Plutarch would definitely have mentioned it.
Giants.
We have already seen many times ancient statues depicting giants, people of enormous height, doors designed for huge people, paintings showing big and small people together, as well as houses, palaces, and halls also made for giants. However, historians relentlessly dismiss all this indirect evidence with a single argument. They say that this was how our ancestors tried to show the greatness of certain royal figures, royal families, or nobility, or to give importance to an event if it concerns engravings or paintings. And it must be said that this position is quite stable. People are indeed prone to exaggeration, but that's not the case with Plutarch because he never directly talks about giants anywhere. However, he draws parallels through his descriptions of battles, and only someone who is attentive will be able to see direct references to ancient giants. And the fact that neither Plutarch nor Arrian publicize this information gives it significance. But how is the mention of giants connected to Siberia? Well, for that, it's enough to read the works of another figure I mentioned a year ago. This is Nicholas Wittson and his work Northern and Eastern Tartary. In it, he not only mentions giants, but also provides illustrations of Tartarian gods. Take a look at them and find 10 differences from the Indian gods Shiva or Ganesha. By the way, he also talks about mythical animals, for example, the legendary unicorn, and provides a sketch of its skull. This is Volume 2, page 254. Of course, images of giant people can be found in India as well. However, now we understand that they were widespread throughout all of Asia and the East. By the way, the meeting with King Porus, even according to the official version, took place right on the border of the Mughal Empire. And now we understand that the Mughals were called great and mighty precisely because of their enormous height. Besides, let's once again remember the wound Alexander received from an arrow in the land of the Malians. Arrian, just like Plutarch, reports that the arrow entered the chest above the nipple and says that air was coming out of it. That is, yes, the lung was pierced. However, only Plutarch reports the size of the arrow as 6 by 8 centimeters. If it had been an average-sized person, death would have come very quickly. However, he survived, and the arrow got stuck in the bone. However, again, for an ordinary person, with such a deep penetration of an arrow of that size, the ribs would have simply been cut in half. And for the arrow to get stuck, the ribs must be much larger than those of a modern human. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Do you believe it or not?
And here's another point that historians just love. When Plutarch first reports that Darius's army was 600,000 men, all historians, as one, literally shout, "We shouldn't believe this." Well, why? Because we just shouldn't. That's not how it works. Plutarch is simply exaggerating the significance of Alexander's victory. Is that possible? Basically, yes. Otherwise, we would have to admit that Alexander's army had giants, while the Persian army was made up of ordinary people. In the next battle at Gaugamela, Plutarch already speaks of Darius's army as being 1,000,000 strong. Again, we shouldn't believe this for the same reasons. But if we follow this logic, then Plutarch should by no means mention the real numbers for the Battle of the Hydaspes, where there were 135,000 Macedonians and only 22 Indians. By this logic, Plutarch should have said that there were at least 1.5 million Indians. But no, he gave a number 6 times smaller than the Macedonians and said that nevertheless, they won with great difficulty, losing almost half of their army. That's a defeat, not a victory. And at the hands of a handful of Indians. So why should we believe that the first two times Plutarch exaggerated without much reason, but in the last case, when there actually was a reason to exaggerate, he didn't do it? That's why I'm sure that Plutarch didn't make anything up and gave the exact numbers. Every time. When talking about the Indian campaign, Plutarch gives the exact dimensions of the Ganges River, which so frightened the Macedonians. It is 5.5 kilometers wide and 200 meters deep. But in reality, the Ganges barely reaches 2 kilometers at its widest points, and its depth is 10 to 12 meters. During the rainy season, it reaches up to 20 meters. Did Plutarch exaggerate once more? Well, let's first take a look at the top widest rivers in the world. And suddenly it turns out that it's the Kama, Volga, Amazon, Nile, Lena, Amur, Ob, and La Plata. So, out of the 8 widest rivers in the world, 1 is in Africa, the 2nd and 3rd are in the Americas, and the remaining 5 are in our Siberia. Well, for example, the Kama's widest point is up to 20 kilometers. The Volga averages from 10 to 27 kilometers. The Amazon, depending on the season, ranges from 11 to 40 kilometers, and the Nile averages 10 kilometers. The Lena sometimes spreads up to 30 kilometers. The Amur reaches 50 kilometers. The Ob is about 60 kilometers, and the La Plata ranges from 50 to 220 kilometers. The Ganges is also among the widest rivers, but only when it comes to the delta, not the river itself, meaning just a small section near the ocean. Now, the depth of the Kama is 29 meters, the Volga up to 45, the Lena up to 25, the Amur up to 50, and the Ob is 25 meters. However, the deepest river in Russia is the Yenisei. Its depth reaches up to 100 meters. But the river isn't that wide, only 650 meters. However, the size of the floodplains ranges from 5 to 40 kilometers. Another detail related to the rivers is that it took Alexander's army 7 months to float down the Hydaspes to the ocean. During this time, according to our estimates, he should have covered from 1,700 to 7,000 kilometers. There are no rivers of that length in India. Yes, I know that officially it's 3,000 kilometers, but most of that distance flows through the Himalayas, where Alexander did not go. But from the battlefield to the ocean, it's only 1,000 kilometers in a straight line. In other words, although we haven't found a river that matches Plutarch's description exactly, the modern Ganges doesn't fit it either. However, statistics show that such a river could only have existed in Siberia. Because in India, there simply aren't such depths, such distances, or such wide rivers. But in Siberia, not only do they exist, there are many of them, and they fit the description much better.
Money.
A huge number of Persian coins are found in Siberia. This is exactly the area of the Kama region near Kungur, the territory of Perm. I won't list everything, otherwise this video will never end. The main thing is the fact itself. And it turns out that either a huge number of ancient trade routes passed through here, which naturally followed the rivers. And this once again confirms that the most important transshipment point could only have been Taganrog, because from there, through the system of rivers and canals, you could get anywhere. Or attention, a shocking sensation. Great Perm is actually Great Persia. Changing just one letter makes it so simple. But everything turns upside down and Great Persia appears. By the way, do you know why Persia is called Persia? You don't know, and nobody knows.
Remezov's map?
We've arrived at Remezov's map. Considering everything mentioned above, The words on the drawn map of Siberia near the Amur River no longer seem like fantasy or fiction. Up to this place, Tsar Alexander the Great reached, hid his gun, and left bells behind. We calculated that Alexander the Great really could have come here. Yes, Plutarch and even Arrian are practically shouting this to us between the lines. And now we have Nicholas, Whitson, and Remazov. All the fortresses that Alexander captured were wooden stockades. This is implied between the lines. For example, during the siege of Halicarnas, the Macedonians calmly filled in the fortress moat, and the archers on the walls did not interfere with this. This is only possible if there were no archers on the wall, and all of them were standing behind it. Breaking through the walls with ordinary battering rams also suggests that they were made of wood. The quick construction of a second wall also points to this. And the construction of a mega tower out of wood directly indicates huge reserves of construction timber. But in those places, there simply isn't that much of it. However, there is plenty of it in Siberia. But there's another nuance. The timber needs to be cut and prepared, which is a long process, and it's especially impossible during a siege. That means the timber had already been prepared in advance in huge quantities. But why? In the case of Halicarnassus, I don't have an answer. But if it was in Siberia, then the answer is obvious. This city was a trading post where timber was harvested for sale, so the warehouses were simply filled with it. And this is still happening. Siberia is a source of timber for all of Europe and China, and a little bit for us too. I apologize, my viewer has accumulated a lot more arguments, but let's save some of them for the future. Otherwise, this video really will never end, and we still have a whole segment ahead of us. And Sharamucha. Do you remember Alexander's first battle with the Persians, the one at the Granicus River, where I didn't understand much? Where were the mountains and cliffs? And why didn't Alexander have another way? And so on. I became curious about what that name means. Obviously, it's either a Greek or Persian name. However, I couldn't find anything similar in Greek by sound. Well, then it must be Persian. I reached out to my subscribers for clarification, not just those who know the language, but those who are, to some extent, native speakers. And in the Persian version, in Farsi, there was a similar word, but its pronunciation wasn't quite the same. It sounded like garnik. In Farsi, this word has several meanings. The first is drowned person or someone who has drowned. The second is mountain cave. The third is fault or fracture. Basically, it makes sense. A river can flow through a fault in the ground. It can go through mountain caves, and of course, you can drown in it. However, something still doesn't add up. On one hand, many rivers start in mountains or caves, and naming a specific river after this is questionable, but calling a river the drowned one is even worse. People get their food from rivers. They provide water, pasture, and nourish all the land around. And even if a river does get a bad reputation, most likely its name will be made more poetic, without insulting the river. On the other hand, I would never confuse the words granic and garnic, no matter how they're pronounced. Well, that's me, but someone else might confuse them. And a crazy idea came to my mind. To pick out letter by letter in Greek, a word that, when pronounced aloud, would sound exactly like granic. And here's what I came up with.
Ogama. Kira, okay.
Gran. Granny, granic.
Still not clear, like this Ural Yike? I won't touch on the question of what the words Ural and Yike mean right now. There's enough information here for a whole video, so I'll answer another very simple and at the same time complicated question. How did Ural turn into Granic? You all know that foreign words are constantly invading our lives, and most often this is connected with reading English brand names in Russian. And since people tend to exaggerate their own importance, most teenagers in puberty think that speaking English is cool. Pubescent youth grow up, but they don't get any smarter. Well, for example, we stopped saying observation, and now we say monitoring. Instead of saying joke, young people say ruffle. Instead of check, they say checknut. Instead of laugh, they say lol. Instead of get angry, they say agritya, banit, bait it, upgrade it, and so on. Young people, as they grow up, change the language according to their own rules. I'm sure that something similar happened with the Greek texts. They wrote the correct name. Then someone helped by turning half of the word upside down. As we already know, this was practiced often. Yes, the same Leonardo da Vinci constantly used mirror writing. Well, and the subsequent translators decided that this was ancient Greek and started reading this word in Greek. That's how we ended up with Granic. Have you ever wondered why Ekaterina, also known as Sophia, or Augusta, supposedly a German, decided to rename the river after the mountains it originates from? Do you think that's logical? But then why aren't there Amur Mountains, Danube Mountains? Where are the Ob Mountains or Yenisei Mountains? Where are the Kama Mountains? Maybe there are in mountains or Ganges Mountains, Nile Mountains? Or where is the Tibet River, the Himalaya River, the Sion River, or the Alps River? So no matter how obvious it may seem, it's illogical. But back in those days, there was a fashion for everything antique, so our enlightened Yekaterina didn't read Plutarch. So, dear linguists, shove your profound conclusions about the origins of certain words from eponyms, hydronyms, and other onyms. Deep where the sun doesn't shine, words are invented and created not by scholars, but by regular guys, street punks, uneducated fools, or trendy girls like Yekaterina. So I think it's clear now that Makedonsky didn't go to modern Persia, but to Siberia, to Great Perm, then to Tartary, and met the great Mughals on the Amur River, Dalderu. And this happened 20 years after the catastrophe. And we learned all this just by reading Plutarch. So does anyone still think that Plutarch can't be trusted? Friends, none of us are immune to mistakes. And if you see a flaw in my logic, don't hesitate. Clearly, properly, and without hesitation, leave your angry comment under the video.